What would a possible future look and feel like if we recognize that humans are only one of many communities on Earth? That these communities are all interconnected in dynamic and reciprocal ways, and that our well-being as humans cannot meaningfully be separated from the well-being of the planet. This was the basis for my exploration into the emerging rights of nature movement as one important and exciting pathway towards potentially adapting and evolving our legal systems to align with and help strengthen the likelihood of bringing about this possible future. Our escalating ecological, climate, and related social crises are well known and documented. These didn't just happen randomly, but are very closely linked to our current activities and the practices we've adopted, relating to expectations of endless growth on a finite planet, a focus on financial profit, privatization, the overlooking of externalities, and the corporate capture of governmental decision-making, as well as the development of exponential technology. We're now at a point at which we can and do have a significantly outsized impact on our environment. And if we continue down this path, we're looking at a future with potentially catastrophic outcomes on ourselves and the planet, and even self-termination of humans as a species. This is a confronting reality to face, but I also feel that for a number of reasons we have potential for hope and transformation on a global scale, and we have choices and agency about which future we move towards. Firstly, as humans, we are highly adaptable. Unlike many other animals, we're not born and immediately able to make our own ways in the world, physically or socially. We spend a long time learning and adapting throughout our lifetimes, which has meant that humans are able to exist and thrive in all parts of the world and in vastly different circumstances. This adaptable nature relates to us as individuals, but also in our group interactions. This is really important to understand, as so many of our collective ways of making sense of the world and our collective decision-making and coordinated action, such as our financial, economic, political, agricultural, legal, and other systems, seem inevitable or static because we're generally born into these and don't really think about them or how they came about. But we build these over time, and we can dismantle them or evolve them and move towards quite radically different systems that are more appropriate and actually generative as ways of living together. Secondly, we have a growing understanding about our global interconnection. For a long time, we've had a shared story about the separation of humans from the rest of the natural world, and even our domination over everything else. This is contrary to the story held for us by many indigenous and other traditional groups, and felt by many of us, that we are inextricably linked to everything else. In recent years, we felt this connection in a more embodied sense, through more severe and significant weather events, the web of our global supply chains, and revelations of the pandemic. And also our shared scientific understanding about our bodies, about ecosystem communication, quantum mechanics, and other topics has expanded so that we can now properly understand ourselves as a process rather than a fixed object, and one that is in constant circular relationship with all life on this planet. So in this context of where we're at globally at this time, and our expanded understanding of what it means to be human, I'm really curious about how we not only take urgent steps to address our challenges, but also in parallel, how we develop other ways of living together over a generational time span. In 2017, news stories were released around the world reporting on the fact that a river in New Zealand had been recognised as a legal person and granted rights. This generated a lot of interest and also questions. What does it mean for a river to have rights? How can a river be considered a person in the law? Who speaks for the river? How can we know what the river wants or needs to realise its rights? Could this change the way we think about environmental protection and restoration, and how we live together in the world more generally? This was particularly interesting to me, as for over a decade, I'd been working as a human rights lawyer, with other lawyers, NGOs, communities and social movements around the world on economic, social and cultural rights, working together to make changes in ways that wouldn't be possible to achieve alone. Although the human rights framework does deal with a lot of issues that are connected with the environment, it is, of course, largely anthropocentric in its focus and its practices. And the fields of human rights and environmental justice were actually very siloed in many ways. So I became increasingly focused on thinking about how the human rights framework and the law more broadly can more explicitly reflect the fact that all of our human activities and lives are embedded at all times in ecological realities, and how we could shift from treating nature as an afterthought within our legal frameworks. My overarching aims of the project were to investigate, understand, and amplify the rights of nature movement, and create practical tools to share my findings and encourage lawyers, activists, and others to connect with and build on these really exciting developments. So I undertook a lot of research, developed a website, and created 3 main practical tools. Firstly, I created case studies of the main examples from around the world. These have been written in a format that I think is particularly useful to lawyers, explaining the jurisdiction, type of legal protection, the facts of the case, how the rights of nature have been recognized, the significance of the development, implementation information, and also sharing links to key court documents, legislation, or other material. Secondly, I created an interactive mapping. This provides a visual of the connected story across the world of similar developments and gives people the option to click through to the specific case studies. Thirdly, I developed a report on rights of nature and practice around the world. This shares what has been happening in different contexts and also provides analysis of the cross-cutting themes that are emerging across these case studies. I wanted to break down the components of the rights of nature examples so that lawyers and others can both follow similar strategies, but also take parts of these to apply in and strengthen strategic human rights litigation or advocacy, or in other areas of law. When we're trying to build persuasive legal arguments, or we're trying to think about which remedies we ought to ask for to really address an issue, we often draw on a patchwork of relevant material from around the world. I wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to do this with this new area of law and way of thinking. So what became apparent across the case studies were 3 main lessons around how we recognize rights of nature, how we come into relationship with the more than human world, and what conditions might be helpful to support us in that process. So in terms of recognizing, I looked at what ecological entity were case studies talking about, which rights have been recognized around the world, what are the different entry points for achieving rights recognition, from litigation to constitutional drafting to legislation, how we shift in practice from thinking law is one fixed idea to recognizing the plurality of laws, and particularly how our formal legal systems can start to align more closely with Indigenous values and ways of living. In terms of relationship, the case studies revealed really interesting aspects and lessons about who speaks or acts for nature in terms of enforcing or realizing these rights in practice, how they might go about doing this, and which other communities support them in doing this. And finally, enabling. What measures are governments or others taking to support this recognition and realization of rights? Whether financial, information, communication, education, structural, or otherwise. A key part of my project was the communication of this material. All of it is available online for free for anyone who wants to read it in more detail or use it in their work. Already, the website has been visited by people in many different countries. I've also sent it out to various networks, legal, Nature Connection, feminist, and other networks, many thousands of people, and I've received very positive feedback and engagement with the material so far, and ideas about how it can be used and ways in which groups might collaborate together. I really welcome any conversations and connections in relation to this project and area of law, and I thank you for taking the time to listen.
Amazing. So, Susie, I take it that all your work there looks like a complete first. There's has anybody made any efforts to collaborate all the information that you've drawn together from around the planet before?
I would say not in this format. When I started to see the news reports and hear about this type of law, when I looked into it more, I really just found a lot of news reports and academic writing, and a lot of the academic writing is really fantastic. And there are a few groups, just maybe less than a handful that I know of around the world, who are helping communities draft these type of laws. But in terms of pulling together case studies that are directed towards legal practitioners in particular, and also taking a sort of a practical cross-cutting report, which brings out questions that I think can be applied, in different settings. Absolutely. About how we relate to the natural world. I haven't seen that in other spaces.
Yeah, drawing out that common information that everybody can use as a resource, incredibly important. So are there people working internationally on this kind of work in terms of driving forward law in different countries with particular projects?
Yes, there are academics working in this area, so important to amplify this message through educational settings. And also there are a number of groups. There's a group in America, the Center for Environmental Law and Defense Fund, I think they're called, who's working specifically with local communities to try to get rights of nature into local ordinances, which can be particularly helpful when you don't have opportunities to change maybe your national legal framework.
Right. And how many of these, did you say beyond human? Was that the way you described these entities that are becoming recognized? But I'm just interested, how many of them are there at this point?
Yeah, great question. I created about, I think, close to 15 case studies. But there are more happening all the time, and definitely more local communities, Indigenous groups advocating to bring rights recognition to more entities around the world. So it seems like almost in a way like a small handful, but actually when you start to look at it as a global movement, it starts to show that these are shared stories across the world. And I should say, of course, this is new to the dominant legal system, but of course not new to many Indigenous and traditional legal systems around the world.
No. Right. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Questions coming in here. Right. What responses are you getting in the legal world to this radical and significant expansion of rights into nature?
Really positive responses. So as I said, I've sent it out to various targeted groups, a lot of whom are probably more receptive or who might have already heard of this approach. But certainly I've got a lot of messages back so far saying, this is something I really wanted to look into. This is something I want to align with my work. And part of what I want to do, and I think others in this field, is to really break it out of the environmental silo. Sometimes people look at anything which has the word nature or environment in the title and think, oh, well, I support it, but I'm not an environmentalist. But actually, right. As we go forward, we're really recognizing that all of our human activities have to be embedded in our ecological realities. So, for example, I also work in the area of corporate accountability, and I can really see the application to the growing momentum towards having mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence of companies. So where companies have to assess their, say, climate impact, the climate impact of their activities. Components from this framework can be useful in really working out, well, who should be involved in that process? What types of information should we be bringing forward or looking at? So it's at early stages. I only released these materials recently, so I think the next stage is to have more of those in-depth conversations and practical workshops and application of how do we apply this to different areas of the law.
Amazing. Real frontier stuff. Right. Catherine says, have you come across the movement to address ecocide and the work of Jojo Mehta on this? And is this part of your work?
Yeah, great question. I definitely am very aware of the ecocide movement and very supportive of it. I think this is a complementary strategy in that ecocide and rights of nature are both looking to evolve our laws to have more of a focus on environmental issues. And also they are both paradigm shifts in how we think more broadly beyond the law about our relationship with the more than human world. I have to say there are differences. Ecocide is the recognition of a crime in the law, so that it would be a crime to cause very significant environmental damage. And it's not yet present at the international level. Rights of nature, I think, is not, it does relate to disputes and dispute resolution. So it has that retrospective aspect like ecocide would, but I see it also as bringing people into relationship along daily life. So like, how do we think on a daily level about activities that might impact a river system or a mountain or a forest ecosystem? How do we think about local budgets to ensure that we have money for participatory processes to bring in the voice of nature? And also, how do we look at disputes when they happen? So I think complementary strategies.
Right. Okay, time for one more. This is so interesting, Susie. It seems to fundamentally challenge my worldview. Do you know of any move to look at the rights of the oceans?
Yes, I think one of the advocacy movements at the moment, they haven't actually achieved recognition of the rights, but it's the rights of the Salish Sea, which is I didn't know about this sea, but it's a sea which is just, I think, off the coast of where Canada and the USA meet on the west coast. So, you know, I mean, this is a movement, and these are questions that could apply to any ecosystem. And that was, you know, one of the interesting things about doing this research is that some countries or areas have applied this to nature generally, and then within specific cases have sort of narrowed it down. So Ecuador has given recognition to the rights of nature, and then you could have a case which focuses on the oceans, whereas other countries have perhaps given rights of nature to a particular river system or a particular lake or lagoon.
Well, I mean, starting at the top with the rights of nature is the way to go, really, isn't it? Rather than doing it piecemeal. Yeah. All right. Well, look, we're out of time. Another amazing project, Susie. Thank you so much for telling us all about it today.
That's a pleasure. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.